Just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here at New York Law School. I'm Anthony Crowell, Dean and President of the Law School, and this is a very timely conversation for our community, and it's a very meaningful program that examines the struggle for racial equality, both in South Africa and the United States. For any of you who are part of our NYLS community or have been engaged on issues related to South Africa's legal history, you know the lasting impact of the late New York Law School professor Stephen Ellmann, who is one of the world's most preeminent scholars of South African constitutionalism. I want to express my gratitude to Steve's spouse, Teresa Del Corso Ellmann, a dean in the graduate program at Rutgers University, who has worked tirelessly to ensure Steve's enormous scholarly impact continues to be felt today, and for all her work in supporting today's event. As you know, we are going to be examining a range of issues and use the book that Steve produced just before he passed. It's an extraordinary body of scholarship that chronicles South Africa's legal history. And it really is an indispensable historical perspective on one of the key figures during much of the nation's turbulent history. And it is a biography entitled "And Justice for All, Arthur Chaskalson and the Struggle for Equality in South Africa." I would say that considering the events we are witnessing daily in this country and around the globe, and especially with the election next week, Steve's absence is felt even more. I know he would have given such insightful perspectives on everything that is currently happening and would have done it with such grace and warmth, and those qualities are ones that our society is in much need of today. Our topic today is a vital reminder of never forgetting to keep a global perspective, even as events within our borders consume our attention. And while the histories of South Africa and the United States are different, they're also very similar. A history of racism and racial injustice continues to be a driving force of many of our societal and political struggles. Indeed, there's so much that both nations can continue to learn from each other and their experiences, from successful moments of reconciliation and legal restoration to countless missed opportunities to resolve deep-seated structural and cultural impediments to true equality. We're very fortunate that to continue Steve's extraordinary legacy of scholarship in these areas, that NYLS is now home to the most amazing Professor Penny Andrews, a wonderful colleague and someone who it was very close to Steve and worked closely with him in building the South Africa Legal Reading Group, and she is a globally renowned scholar from South Africa. She joins me today in moderating today's panel discussion with two historic leaders, advocates, and chroniclers. We'll hear their perspective on the nation's struggle for racial equality, and those guests today are former Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Albie Sachs, and the award-winning author and journalist, Charlayne Hunter-Gault. I'm very eager to hear from both of them and to discuss Steve's biography of Arthur Chaskalson. It is an indispensable resource, and we hope all of you will get a copy of it and enjoy the benefits of reading it and the perspectives you will gain. Most importantly, I have the honor now of introducing Teresa Del Corso Ellmann, who will offer her own welcome to all of you. And as I said earlier, Teresa has done so much to keep Steve's work and memory at the forefront, and she's been a wonderful partner and collaborator with our law school for so many years. Today's event would not have happened without her leadership and efforts. I know we'll speak more in the near future on Steve's work, but today is a special day, and now it's my privilege to ask Teresa to share her perspectives. Teresa?
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Anthony and Penny and the entire New York Law School team for organizing this event. And thank you, Charlayne and Albie, for joining us on this very special day. I have a few comments I'd like to share, and I'm going to do that with a screen share to give you the benefit of seeing some photographs of Steve and his life working on South Africa as a scholar. So I'm really privileged to, and thank you all for the opportunity to be able to open up today with tell you a bit about Steve's story as the biographer of Arthur Chaskalson. And I know that we're eagerly awaiting to hear more from Albie and Charlayne, so I won't take too much time, but I hope that my comments will help to further set the context for our discussion. I want to tell you the story of Steve, his love of South Africa, and his masterwork, the biography of Arthur Chaskalson, a legal giant who was part of the Rivonia trial defense team and the first leader of the Legal Resources Center, one of South Africa's first public interest law firms. Later in life, Arthur participated in the drafting of the new South African Constitution and was appointed by Nelson Mandela to be the first Chief Justice of the South African Constitutional Court. Steve's legal career began in the American South, where he clerked for the Honorable Elbert Tuttle in Atlanta, Georgia, and then went on to spend 6 years as a staff attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, where his practice included institutional reform litigation on behalf of mentally ill and mentally disabled people and prison inmates, voting rights cases, anti-Ku Klux Klan suits, and defense work in capital murder trials and post-conviction proceedings. As a young law professor at Columbia, Steve was invited to co-teach with Dick Mosinecki and Felicia and Sidney Kentridge the course Legal Responses to Apartheid. In the spring of 1988, Steve met Arthur and taught the course with him. Arthur told him that if he really wanted to understand South Africa, he must visit the country, which Arthur helped him to do. That visit was the first of many and the beginning of a 30-year love affair with South Africa. Steve's work with the Southern Poverty Law Center deepened his already strong commitments to the use of law to fight injustice. And after he got to know about the challenges in South Africa, he was hooked. There, he found lawyers doing the kind of work he had done in Alabama, except with the whole government against them and no constitution to protect them. But as Steve would note, the anti-apartheid lawyers did have a real tradition of courts maintaining the rule of law. And for Arthur, the rule of law could be, indeed should be, part of the fight for justice. And so South Africa would become a focal point of Steve's scholarship for the rest of his life. In the early years, he focused on how anti-apartheid lawyers used the law to fight and challenge the apartheid system. As South Africa transitioned to democracy, he applied his legal analysis to the exciting process of building a democracy, writing a constitution, building a new constitutional court system, and the role of the judiciary in a new democracy. And he was fascinated. This fascination led to many research trips to South Africa, and importantly, a great dedication to supporting the development of young scholars working on South Africa, whether they were based in the United States, South Africa, or elsewhere, by co-hosting with Penny Andrews, the South Africa Reading Group, first at Columbia, and now for the past 25 years at New York Law School. 6 years ago, he and Penny organized an amazing 2-day symposium at New York Law School to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the South African Constitution, which brought together a dynamic group of international scholars and practitioners. The Chaskalson family invited Steve to write the biography of Arthur 5 years ago this month. I recently reread the email from Arthur's widow, Lorraine, inviting Steve to take on the project, and I vividly remember the honor and joy that the request brought to him. However, he hesitated on taking on the commitment because he was not feeling well. Nonetheless, as is not unusual for a scholar, he began to dream about what it would be like to work on the project. We discussed that this could easily be a 5-year project that would also give him the opportunity to spend a significant amount of time in South Africa. And then a month later, in November 2015, we received the devastating news that he had stage 4 cholangiocarcinoma, cancer of the bile duct, which is a rare and aggressive cancer with a poor prognosis. Steve entered treatment, and after a good response, his medical team told him that he could take on a 2-year project. And with the blessing of the Chaskalson family, Steve set out to write the biography he could write in the time that he had. Steve's approach to working on the biography was to have his primary source material be oral history interviews that he could do over the phone, Skype, or WhatsApp, or in person in New York. We were able to undertake 2 trips to South Africa and the UK for in-person interviews in 2016 and 2017. The result is an amazing compilation of voices and perspectives on Arthur and the impact he had on South Africa's fight against apartheid and the transition to democracy. Steve sought to answer the question of how did Arthur become the man that he became? And to do that, Steve brought the archival record into conversation with the interviews. His gift of deep concentration and focus on detail allowed him to study closely legal texts and arguments, and through this close reading, reveal new insights. This project for Steve was as life-sustaining as any medical treatment he received. A month before he passed away, Steve completed his last interview and the manuscript. He had the opportunity to share that accomplishment with many of you at the event to celebrate his work at New York Law School in February 2019, an event he deeply cherished. Just before his passing, it gave Steve great pleasure to know that his work would be published as a binational collaboration between Pan Macmillan South Africa and New South Books based in Montgomery, Alabama. This publishing partnership reflects so well Steve's deep connection to Alabama, South Africa, and social justice. The collaboration has allowed Steve to share with the world the story he wanted to tell about Arthur, his life, and Arthur's legacy. In closing, I hope that Steve's book and his story of Arthur will inspire us and remind us to fight for justice and to use the law to fight for what is right. Thank you for letting me share Steve's story. And now I will turn things back over to Dean Crowell to continue the program.
Thanks so much, Teresa. That was beautiful and such a warm set of memories of Steve and the important work that he undertook and how much he all meant to us and the impact that he both had and continues to have. So thank you. Penny and I are now going to moderate a dialogue between Charlayne and Albie. Penny, do you want to start off?
Yes, I'd like to start off, but also to say thank you to Teresa and you, Anthony, for helping us celebrate Steve's life. I particularly want to give a shout out to Justice Motseneke, I know who's in the audience, and he was the first South African that Steve invited to Columbia, and followed by Felicia and Sydney Kentridge. I know that Albie had visited a few years before then, but Steve was not yet at Columbia. So it's just wonderful. And of course, I want to welcome everybody in the audience, and thank you, Charlayne and Albie, for agreeing to be part of this. So let me start with a sort of a curtain raiser of a question. I mean, Steve has beautifully illustrated Arthur's life growing up in colonial and then apartheid South Africa, and the impact that it has had on his life and the choices that he made. So I wonder if I could start by asking the two of you. Charlayne, you grew up in the segregated South. Albie, you grew up in apartheid colonial and apartheid South Africa. Just talk a little bit about your sort of growing up and how it influenced your personal and your professional choices, the values that you now embrace. So maybe I could start with you, Charlayne, and then move on to Albie.
Well, thank you. And it would take me the rest of this meeting to thank all of you who are participating and who've done such amazing work, and to just have memories with Albie. But I'm going to try to answer your question very quickly. And I don't think it's going to be that different actually from either Stephen's or Albie's, because even though I grew up in the segregated South, I grew up in that old African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I actually, despite the fact that we were segregated and often at our segregated schools had books that we got hand-me-downs from the white schools with pages missing, what was important is also what Steve has so beautifully put into words. We had history, and that village that brought us up to not be affected by segregation taught us our history, and they taught us about the Black people who had struggled going all the way back to, I know there's a disagreement over 1619, but we had the history of Black people coming here from Africa and never accepting their positions as second class. And so when they couldn't give us first class citizenship, they gave us a first class sense of ourselves. And that's how we survived segregation and all that it entailed, trying to make us feel second class. There was no way we could because of our village and because of our history.
Thank you.
Yes, well, it's very different for me. And maybe my very earliest memory, or amongst my earliest memories, I'm aged about 4.
Albie, can you turn your volume up just a little bit? Thank you.
Okay, I'll come a little close. Is that better?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm back to the age of about 4. And I have a little brother aged 2, Johnny. And my mom, Ray, is saying, tidy up, Uncle Moses is coming. Now, Uncle Moses wasn't Moses Khan or Moses Levine. He was Moses Kotani. And Uncle Moses Kotani was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of South Africa. And my mother, Ray, was his typist. So it wasn't an average, normal South African family. And my mom adored Moses Kotani. And I grew up in a home where my mother was working for a black man whom she respected enormously and felt very privileged to be his secretary. That was normal. The world outside for me was the abnormal world of racism. And it was also an exciting world because my mother's friends, mostly women, she was separated from my dad, were vital, strong, independent, involved in trade union work, full of energy, and dreaming about revolution and change and transformation. So all of those things were came with my mother's milk, but the school I went to, the surroundings I was in, was racist South Africa. But it meant I had that enormous head start compared to Arthur. And in Arthur's case, the story of his journey is not overcoming disadvantage, like Dekhan, Moseneke, and the others. It was overcoming advantage and growing up with the advantages of a comfortable home, going to quite a posh school, learning lots of things about being correct and decent and to play soccer and cricket and all the rest. And what makes his journey in that sense so very special is how through his legal practice, very much through his relationship with Lorraine, who was more radical than he was, how he developed his great intuitions and skills in ways that identified completely the struggle for liberation in South Africa. And it made him formidable and a very wonderful leader of our court. And I claimed at the time of his death that he was the greatest lawyer in the world of that particular time. And I'm going ahead a little bit now, but let me just say it. Greatest not because he was more brilliant than anybody else, but he was in the right place at the right time, where law had a huge role to play in our transformation, magnificent brain, a big team of people around him, and he gave that superb leadership that required more than just intellectual skill. It was social understanding, it was empathy, it was institutional creation and development. And so having this magnificent book about a magnificent man is something really worth paying tribute to. And Teresa, I can't help but say so much love to you. It was so wonderful seeing that warm, smiling picture of Steve when we saw so often. And so much thanks to you for keeping the project alive. It's keeping his memory alive, but also the memory of Arthur alive. Thank you. Thank you.
Penny, and I just, oh, sorry.
Sure, Charlayne. Charlayne, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing as I listened to Albie talk about that and give us this great history. One of the things that Stephen has in his book is something about Judge Elbert Tuttle. And he meant a lot to me. I probably wouldn't be sitting here today had it not been for him, because when Hamilton Holmes and I desegregated the University of Georgia in 1961 under the order of Judge William Bootle, a federal judge, the university managed to stop the day we were desegregating with a court order saying they needed to do something else. I won't go into all the details. But then our lawyers immediately went to court. Constance Baker Motley and Donald Hollowell went to court in Atlanta, and we went to a black house in a person's house in Athens, Georgia, and waited for the decision. And all of a sudden, we got the news that a judge had overruled Judge Bootle. And I heard my mother say, "God is great." And I didn't know the details until later when I looked at the newspaper the next day and it said Tuttle boots Bootle. And that enabled Hamilton and me to enter the University of Georgia January 9th in 1961. Tuttle boots Bootle. That's history.
Yes.
history. That's
Yes.
amazing. Amazing. Albie, let me follow up on some of your comments. So thinking about Steve's book and the value that it holds, we're here as a community of lawyers and law professors and others. How might we think about using the importance of this book in really understanding not only South Africa's democratic and constitutional history, but the lessons in it? How can we think about using it more broadly to teach the next generations?
One of the problems is the book's too good. It's too much. It's all there. It's got detail and nuance, and that's part of its richness. But I think it's terrible for teaching. It's fabulous for a resource. Right now, I was looking for a thick book to lift up my screen so that my eye level would be correct. And lo and behold, here's this enormous book that's there. So it's an amazing repository, and it's a kind of an anthology, and it's written in a very accessible and useful way. So it's something to dip into. But I think somehow the story of Arthur's life and the meaning of the Constitution can depend upon that, but I wouldn't make it required reading.
I wonder if I also want to encourage the audience to put questions into the Q&A. So let me just continue this conversation, Charlayne and Albie. As you know, many parallels have been drawn between South Africa and the United States, and particularly the shared struggle towards eradicating racial injustice. We know that several volumes, academic volumes, have been published, notably George Fredrickson's White Supremacy, in which he compares the study of the American South in South Africa and so on. And there are many, many others as well. So when both societies were struggling against racism in the official form, Jim Crow in the United States and apartheid in South Africa, the situations were not that different. But since 1994, things have changed. Black majority in South Africa now has political power, and the United States elected a Black president twice. So my question is do these parallels between the United States and South Africa continue to be useful or productive? Which purposes do you think they serve? Charlayne, I'll start with you.
That's a toughie. Well, I go back to those days when so many people that I knew were involved in the anti-apartheid demonstrations here in America, and saw similarities between what we had overcome here and what they felt was possible in South Africa. And I think that was a very good moment in America in particular to review our own struggles and to encourage South Africans to keep up their struggle, because we had our victories after all, as they say. And I do think that was important. Albie can talk about that. And you fast forward to today, well, look at the history. And I think that so many Americans were so excited when South Africa did end apartheid, and when Nelson Mandela became president, and in fact, when they put together a constitution that was even more progressive than ours in the United States, or most places in America, which recognized people's right to determine their own sexuality. And Albie can speak to that as well. So I think that South Africa has taught us things as well. At the same time, I think that we have some of the same issues today. Because you see young people in South Africa demonstrating, and Albie can talk about that. And you see young people and older ones in America demonstrating. And I think the point is, in both situations, as Julian Bond used to say, you got to do more than demonstrate. You got to go back and work on actually putting things into practice that that you've protested for and that you continue to protest for. And I keep up with what's going on in South Africa to the extent that I can through articles that friends of mine like John Strimlaw write and others. I think that we're back having some of the same issues and hopefully inspiring each other to continue the struggle towards full equality.
Thank you.
You know, Penny, the one aspect of description I disagree with is parallel, because parallel lines never meet. That is the memory of parallel. We met, we intersected, we interacted. I remember in my youth movement, Charlayne, you go back to 61, I go back to 51, 52. In the Youth Society, our hero was Paul Robeson. And I can still sing some of these songs. I dreamt I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you or me. You know, why should I remember it all that time? He was the Mandela of our age. And he was somebody who represented something in the United States, in the world, who reached out to everybody. And we felt immense connection with Black struggles in the United States. And when I came to the States later on, I felt that same sense of connection. And in the end, the divestment campaigns, the Free South Africa movement, the people who trained themselves to the railings in Washington, D.C., in the 1980s, giving rise to the anti-apartheid resolutions or decisions in Parliament, in the Congress, that was actually the tipping point. It's not the cause of our liberation and breakthrough, but the tipping point when apartheid collapsed was when the banks in America refused to roll over the loans. And that was when they realized in Pretoria that now they have to start digging their trenches for a defensive action. And so the connections were very, very real. We identified them, and we identify today. I still remember, Charlayne, you know, how we used to divide over Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? As I'm sure people like yourself also, loving them both and wanting to embrace both of them, even if in some ways they represented different currents. We followed all those different aspects. We felt very, very closely about it. The one thing we didn't like was for our struggle in South Africa to be called a civil rights movement. And that's created quite a lot of confusion. The civil rights movement was sitting on benches and attacking the symbols of segregation. We were fighting for national liberation. Civil rights is in the constitutional framework where your rights are being suppressed. We wanted to overturn the whole caboodle of apartheid. And so to say it's a civil rights struggle meant somehow we wanted inclusion, incorporation into white society. We didn't want that. But that was a kind of conceptual issue that we had. We identified so strongly with our brothers and sisters in the US, and we felt immense love and support from them. And those connections continue today. When people marched in Black Lives Movement in the United States, and we saw it on TV in South Africa, we were marching in spirit and soul with you. And it was only the fact that we were all in lockdown that we couldn't find moments to bend our knee and to get sporting actions and so on in solidarity with that. So those connections were strong then, and they're very strong today.
It's interesting, Albie, that you would mention Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, because Pennell Joseph, whose book you may know, The Sword and the Shield, it's comparing and contrasting King and Malcolm X. And what was fascinating was his point that, you know, what we're doing today, we're having debates, if you will, about the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa and so on. And what Pennell reminds us of, and he did again last night or the night before, I lose track in this self-quarantining situation, but he reminded us, he said that Watts, there were, you know, remember there were demonstrations in Watts out for some of the same things that people are demonstrating against today. You know, Black lives often didn't matter in places like Watts, where people were systemically discriminated against. And so here was Martin Luther King with the nonviolent protest. There was Malcolm X, you know, with supporting the less than nonviolent protest, let's put it that way. And he says that Watts transformed King. And he said he now regarded, I'm looking at his text here, disruption rooted in anti-Black racism as a form of political protest, one that he disagreed with, but refused to cast negative judgments against. And he said that while King felt that the way to go was nonviolence, he also said that Watts represented one direction that the Black freedom struggle might pursue if nonviolence failed, which I think is a fascinating way of looking at this. And the whole book is another one like Stephen's that I would highly recommend, because it really does help us appreciate. And Albie, I'd be interested in what you have to say about this. But in my reading of history and my experience of things happening today, so many times I think what goes around comes around, and how we get away from repeating some of the same mistakes of the past, which challenge some of the things that your generation and my generation and this generation are still fighting. Do you see that? Do you see any progress?
Yeah, come on. The world is hugely different from what it was. And we've made enormous advances. And in making those advances, our demands are higher. And so we've become more angry at corruption and failure and sliding back and so on. You're going to have elections, I believe, I've heard it said, like 10,000 million trillion times a day in a few days' time. And they are enormously meaningful. And it is a challenge between that retrogression, things going back, and that forward movement, which I believe is an accumulated forward movement.
Yeah, well, I was playing devil's advocate, actually, because one of the things that Pennell said night before last, and which is true, is that even though we had Black and white together and we shall overcome during the civil rights movement, and I often am a little disturbed when we generalize too much about white people and Black people, because I like to remind people that a lot of white people died on our behalf, Goodman and Schwerner and Viola Liuzzo. But so you did have integrated struggles back in those days, but today it is much broader, it seems, and the point that you were just making, he gave the actual numbers of people today demonstrating in communities all over the country, Black, white, young, old. And so I totally agree with you after throwing out that little challenge to you, that we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go. And I think we have a history that can help us move forward.
Anthony, thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the role of the U.S. Supreme Court versus that of the Constitutional Court. Obviously, for us in the United States, the role and structure of the court is one of the questions that has come up during this election year. And obviously, for us, we have lifetime appointments to the court. In the Constitutional Court, there are 15-year terms. Albie, Charlayne, what are some of the lessons we can learn from each other on this point? And Albie, having served, what's the value of that, or what are the limitations of that, and what should Americans consider?
You know, when I was at law school in the 1950s, the court we looked to was the U.S. Supreme Court. It was kind of a leader, not just technically, but morally in the world, in terms of a court that is now getting into deep values of human dignity, creative and expressive. That's gone. That's gone. It's not a court that is quoted, that's cited. And many American judges will say, good, we don't want to be cited in some shithole court in some shithole country in some shithole continent. Maybe they feel that. But for me, it's a great sadness because I know when I was sitting as a judge and looking at judgments and looking for intellectual resources that could help us solve our problems in our country, there was a whole generation of judges from your Supreme Court who were fantastic. Brennan became somebody whom I met personally, and I could find his writings would be so rich that they would transcend the US and be very useful in the context of South Africa. Later on, I became very friendly with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with Stephen Breyer and others, and they still represent something that's valuable and highly respected. And of course, RBG became a symbol not just in the US, but throughout the world, of somebody doughty and forthright and standing for something honorable. So these things sort of do continue. It's an enormous sadness for me to see the reputation and the standing of the US Supreme Court go, and very saddening to see it somehow become embroiled in the cultural wars, so that appointments depend upon which side are you on in the cultural war. And they're ugly. And instead of the appointment to the court being the source of celebration and joy in the country, it's celebration for one side and denunciation on the other side. The court should be uniting people, finding principal ways of looking at the world, dealing with hard problems in ways that can unite the nation. Instead, the court becomes a battleground itself. It leads to further division in the country. I think it's very, very serious. I say this with great sadness. And I see that there are serious discussions about reconstituting the court. I believe there's strong arguments in favor of a bigger court to be able to attend to more business anyhow.
Right.
That's quite independently of the present things. But it'd be marvelous if somehow the court could lose that identity it's got now as being somehow divided in a completely partisan way and not serving the nation as a whole. The lesson from South Africa is we created a new court that played a fantastic role. I'm not speaking about my years on the court, but in recent years, dealing with corruption, dealing with racism in a very principled, very, very thoughtful way. It's one of our institutions that's done magnificent work in South Africa and is cited throughout the world. I was told by somebody on the German Federal Constitutional Court, when they had decisions in many areas, the first judgments they look to opinions are those from the South African court. So that shows that the important role that courts can play, and of course we come back to Arthur, because he was the institution builder, not just a brilliant judge himself, the institution builder, who had a team of brilliant, difficult, sometimes angry, but vital, sharp-minded people whom he had to help meld into what became a constitutional court with an organized rhythm and way of doing things, a style of work, a friendliness and empathy and warmth. So I think the world can gain a lot from the South African court working experience, and as we South Africans gained enormously from what the world had to offer.
But let me play journalist for a moment, because as a citizen, I'm thinking about this big debate over Roe v. Wade, and I have a friend who wrote an editorial in our local paper yesterday citing her husband, Kenneth Edelin, who was a great pioneer in the struggle to affirm Roe v. Wade. And without going into all of that detail, as I said, I don't often take public positions, although I am going through all of this as a voter. But I want to ask you if you have experience with judges who have one identity, any change in them based on reality and the facts. I'm thinking in part about Justice Roberts, who you know, has one identity on the court, but who has moved quite surprisingly sometimes on some of his rulings. Have you experienced judges who have one identity politically and seen them surprise you and change their mind? And for those who are so depressed about the most recent justice appointed to the Supreme Court, do you have any hope that her positions currently might change? I mean, Justice Roberts changed, and everybody I know is, because I know a lot of people who tend to be liberal, who are very depressed. And I just wonder if you've ever experienced with any judges who had one political position who changed over time, or whom you might expect to change.
Yes, the judge who made the biggest change that I've ever encountered was Harry Blackman.
Who?
Harry Blackman, who wrote Roe v. Wade, yes.
Right.
And he started off very conservative with a kind of small town view. And you read his biography, it's very, very fascinating. And he never quite explains, or the biographer quite, why he made that leap. I think his daughters might have had something to do with it. And I heard him actually, I attended a seminar that he presided over and he ended up with Roe v. Wade versus Wade. And he explained that he was a third choice as judge, and he started off very, very conservative, and he changed. But he never actually said what it was that triggered the change. I had the pleasure of having lunch at the US Supreme Court. Stephen Breyer invited me, and Chief Justice Roberts was exceptionally charming and friendly in a very nice way. The cuisine was awful. The conversation was terrific. And I was impressed with him in terms of, if you like, his style and openness. And I don't want to psychoanalyze or theorize, but I think to a certain extent his intellectual agenda that made him conservative in the US judicial arena has largely played itself out, the issues that he was, as it were, brought up on and felt strongly on. And now new issues are cropping up. I also feel he feels very strongly about the honor and dignity of the court, and that he's very alarmed at the extent to which the court is being driven into a corner and made to appear not the court of all Americans, but the court of one side. So that would make him, in that sense, more even-handed. So I don't think that maybe he's changed so much as the courts and the issues cropping up maybe have changed. So he still remains a centrist, but a centrist in the tradition of he can go this way and that. Maybe a little bit more like Sandra Day O'Connor, appointed as very conservative. And she developed internally and thoughtfully, and also a very lovely person whom I met afterwards. So that's such a rich tradition that's been lost on the court. It's now, which side are you on? And do you expect it to be loyal to a particular position? And I don't think it's all that helpful. On our court, our trajectories are very different. My concern was that our first generation of judges, we were very progressive minded, very thoughtful, very into transformation change. And my concern was we would be replaced by a new generation of black judges who would become ultra technical and ultra formalistic to show that they are real judges. And go into quoting Latin, we gave up Latin. That was my fear. And happily, that did come to pass. So you've been a fabulous new generation of judges, many of whom served in the Legal Resources Center under Arthur in earlier periods. Women judges who were fast-tracked when we had a woman Minister of Justice fast-tracking them, and they are now up in the higher ranks of the court, and they are also doing wonderful work. So we're not looking for changes in the South African kind of complex of people who started off conservative, racist, reactionary, homophobic, whatever it might be, and who were won over. Our problems are of a different order.
Do you think that the constitutional structure is being different, certainly with the South Africa Constitution having explicit rights ensconced in the Constitution, social and economic rights? How does that play into this discussion? How does it distinguish sort of some of the cultural contours, Albie? What makes it?
You know, I'm amused when I remember the first question put to me at that very paltry lunch that I had at the Supreme Court was from Justice Alito. And he said, Justice Sachs, would you say your court is an activist court? And I said, yes, Justice Alito, but we have an activist constitution.
Right.
And I'm one of the original intenders. So if you wanted the mind of the original intent, I can say I am an original intender. But our original intent was to have a constitution that was a living tree. So from every point of view, both textually with a wonderful preamble, including all these expansive rights, social and economic rights, and a constitution designed not to freeze the status quo to make sure that there's no reneging on what's been achieved, but to transform a very unequal society. Everything was pointing in the direction of change. And yet if we'd had conservative judges, they can read down the constitution. They can impose technical readings that deprive it of its spirit. So we had to have judges imbued with that spirit of transformation and change. Fortunately, we did have that. But our job in that sense was much easier than the job of so-called activist judges. And just by the way, the most activist judges in the last decade or two in the world have been United States Supreme Court judges. They've been activists tearing down laws on campaign finances, activist judges in tearing down laws on protecting voters' rights, activist judges tearing down laws on gun control, all passed by local communities. So it's not a question of whether you're an activist judge or not. The conservative judges have been very activist. But are you activist on the side of the powerful, the entrenched, the rich, or are you activist on the side of the marginalized? I think that's been the real gap in the United States.
So I'm going to, I know I had some questions, but I'm going to take the liberty now because there are a few questions from the audience and I'd like us to sort of be responsive to the audience. So Anthony and Teresa, if it's okay with you, I'm going to be reading 2 or 3 questions because there are quite a few, 2 or 3 questions at a time, handed back to Charlayne and Albie, and then Teresa, you can read the next 3 and maybe Anthony. So this is a question from Donna Katzen. Albie and Charlayne, could you speak to the continuing challenges in both South Africa and the United States to extend social and political rights, although these are not assured, into economic and social rights as well? And then Donna says it's great to have you both with us. The second question is from Richard Marsico, who's a faculty member at New York Law School. You know, Donna Katzen is a shared interest. Richard Marsico says, one critique I've heard of the South African Constitution is that the government cannot enforce positive rights. And he says, I do not agree. Can you address this critique? Then the third one is not a question, but it's from Justice Dikgang Motseneke, and he says, I am listening with much excitement, gratitude, and fulfillment. Well done, Teresa, the law school, Charlayne, Penny, and Dean Crowell. The last word I spare for my judicial colleague and comrade, Albie. He sang also at the court. Much love, Dikgang.
Oh, that's very nice. I know I'm going to defer to Albie on the details of this question, but I have just been out in one of the predominantly Black communities here in Sarasota, Florida, talking with a variety of Black voters some non-voters because they are ex-convicts and they cannot vote for 5 years after they have been, till after they've been released for 5 years and paid all of their fines. And while there's money available now from various sources, so many of them cannot vote, but they have views. And I was very surprised to find that quite a few of them see the economic issues as dispositive in how they view the candidates. And when I talked to someone who was a community organizer, he sort of understood how some of them could possibly be pro one of the candidates, the Republican, because he said they have all experienced inequities, systemic racism that has affected their economic situation, that theirs and their parents and their grandparents. And so even though my husband, Ron Gault, who actually came to South Africa at the end of apartheid and started a bank because the bank JP Morgan had left during apartheid. But, you know, someone told him after 8 years of President Obama, why should I vote? He was canvassing. I don't get involved in politics in that way, but he was canvassing. And one of the Black guys told him, why should I vote? Ain't nothing happened for me in the last 8 years. That was 8 years of President Obama. And now that impact of systemic racism is still affecting people's views about who they would, some should I say, about if they could vote, who they would vote for. And so those issues that are the result of systemic racism, which also are seeing a majority, a disproportionate number of people of color having COVID-19 infections. They're seeing a majority don't have a job anymore, can't pay their rent, can't take care of their children. So, you know, until these issues get resolved, I think that people are going to be looking for whoever is making promises, whether they're lying or not, but that's how they get persuaded about who to support. Now, that may not have answered your question, but I just happy to hear Donna asking about economic rights. And what I have seen is one of the most important elements that is affecting, one of the most important issues that is affecting how people are perceiving who to vote, determining who to vote for, if they could vote.
Albie?
Right, well, I'll get straight back to the question of the role of the law and the courts and the Constitution in terms of social and economic rights. I mean, it's very cautionary what Charlayne is saying. And it sounds very sad because, you know, we're always saying we're not just fighting for a full stomach. We fight for dignity. We fight for dignity. We want to feel free. And poor people can put up with poverty, but not if their leaders are corrupt, and not if they feel they're being bullied. And there's a kind of a sadness and a cynicism in this attitude. Well, you know, more Black people, Latinos have got jobs in the last 4 years. To hell with all the rest. That's not what really matters. But I think in the end, we always come back to human dignity. And that's where the law does have a big role to play. And in our country, the most important case, possibly in all my years on the court, was the Treatment Action Campaign case, where people living with HIV came to court demanding access to antiretrovirals. And the government at that stage was holding back for rather absurd reasons, HIV denialism. And the court upheld the rights of women living with HIV to have access to nevirapine if they were about to give birth. And it didn't only save the lives of tens of thousands of children, it transformed our whole country's attitude towards HIV. We now have the biggest antiretroviral program in the world. Sadly, we still have the biggest incidence of HIV. but it was one particular issue where it was people on the ground organizing in the community, coming to court, getting publicity, getting journalists like yourself to play a very, very important role in raising consciousness. All of these things coming together meant that there was a transformation that actually saved our country, because it wasn't just a health issue, it was becoming a calamity for the whole country. And I think in kind of outlook terms, if we're dealing with the huge surge towards recognizing interdependence that's come about with COVID-19, away from this competitive view of the world of everybody fighting for their own space, then you've got to look at social and economic rights. You've got to look at your neighbor. You've got to see the village you grew up in becoming the village of the world. And I think it's going to require legal thinkers to move away from seeing rights simply in terms of speech, of voting, of organizing, mobilizing, and maybe protecting property, seeing rights in terms of food and education and access to jobs and training. And I think that's maybe where the gap between what the former felons are saying and what we are urging gets closed. And just as a matter of interest, one of the judgments that gave me most satisfaction sitting on the Constitutional Court of South Africa was to say it's not only ex-felons who have the right to vote, prisoners have the right to vote. That the vote is the one thing that unites everybody in the nation, the humblest and the most exalted, the most disgraced and the most profoundly respected people. You're united by the vote. It literally says everybody counts. And in a divided society like South Africa, like the United States, the vote is important, not just control over political power. It's important for dignity. It means you count, you matter, you have a right to be heard, you have to be listened.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Penny, would you like me to pull a few
Please.
additional questions?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Okay, so I'm going to pull two questions from old friends of Steve's who are both practicing lawyers. So the first is from Joel Berger, who says, assuming a Biden victory on Tuesday, what should we do to review and address the blatant racism and corruption that we've been subjected to during the past 4 years in the United States? South Africa's model of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or something stronger involving prosecution of Trump as a lesson that American democracy will not tolerate such behavior? That's a big question. And the next question I'm going to pull is from Elena Seifert Rivera. Greetings from Chicago. Wonderful program today. Given the changes we've seen in the judiciary under the current presidential administration, and given the unlikelihood of a broad-scale rewriting of the US Constitution, do the panelists see the legislative branch coming in to fill the progressive role we can no longer rely on the courts to fill? Is there a path to a more united and racially just American society through the legislative branch of the US government? And she goes on, since I don't know much about South Africa, is there anything Americans can learn from that country in this regard?
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, 2 mouthfuls.
I'm gonna let Albie start on that one.
Okay, on the first one, the Truth Commission one, of all the papers I've written, the one that created the biggest stir wasn't on law. It was on culture, and I wrote it in '89 before we came back to South Africa. And one of the themes was how impoverished the progressive culture of the movement struggle was becoming, because we were full of slogans. And one of the points I made is the enemy is camping in our heads. We're obsessed with the enemy, and we don't deal with ourselves. And we don't deal with the contradictions in our own lives because the enemy is dominating us. So for me, it would be very sad if a certain person whose first name begins with a D dominates our imaginations and thinking and obsessions long after he's out of office, assuming he goes out of office. I think we're all going to need detoxification to get our bloodstreams moving normally with oxygen and energy and so on, rather than thinking in terms of revenge. That would be my initial reaction. The biggest revenge would be to ignore him, to say he's unimportant, and he's a little guy who fell off the wall and failed dismally. To me, that would be the biggest revenge. The big story that those of us outside think is not about him, but about 40% of the population supporting him. That's the bigger puzzle. And that's the puzzle that really has to be looked at rather than going for one particular person. In terms of the role of the courts and the judiciary, the tradition I grew up in was don't trust the judges. They come from an elite class. They tend to be conservative. Fight your battles out in the streets and in the legislature. Then when somehow the legislature was failing, the courts took over that role. And it's amazing how it transformed my thinking once I became a judge in the progressive role. But I think it's not the one or the other. But if you put all your eggs in one basket, you pay a price for that. And the one positive that will come out is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg was saying on the abortion issue. She felt winning the battle on the basis of privacy in the Supreme Court is always vulnerable. It'd be much better to win the battle in the legislature on principles of equality. So maybe good will come out of bad in that respect. And I think the lessons one can learn from South Africa is just that I think we sing better and we dance better than many Americans sing and dance who are in the political struggle.
Well, I can't go to the legal issues actually, but what I can say is that there's some interesting debates going on in this country, one of which involves reparations and whether or not individuals should get reparations or how you allocate reparations. And I've been following a number of articles and positions by people who have different points of view. And I think it's a very good conversation that's being had, because I don't think that people in my position, although I'm a journalist and I don't make a lot of money, but and I'm semi-retired, but I think that some of the arguments I've seen for how to determine who should get the reparations, if there should be organizations that get the reparations or whatever, but that discussion is going on. And I think that the other issue is how are people being educated? Because one of my frustrations these days when I talk to some young people, not the guys I was talking to the other day, the ex-cons and so forth, but a lot of young people who get their information from Twitter. And it is affecting our language, it is affecting our grammar, and it is also affecting, I think, our capacity, especially the younger ones who are only being educated, but some of the older ones too, being educated through social media, which is how we get such distorted perspectives on things. So we've got to figure out how, I think, to better educate our communities about these issues. And I don't think that, you know, all of the eggs are going to be in any one basket, but I am encouraged by the discussions that I read among educators from, you know, state institutions, as well as places like Harvard and Princeton and others, who are really working hard on trying to figure out how you deal with this issue of systemic racism, and also how people can become more active in expressing their choices. But information is critical. And I think that's going to be one of our really big challenges, not least because As one of the young organizers I talked to in Newtown the other day, he said, look, I'm not even thinking about the national race. I'm more concerned with what's happening at the local level. Now, that's a good position to take. At the same time, so that's a semicolon, not a but, so many of our local newspapers are going out of business because people can't afford to stay in business. Some of the best journalists are now having to go to other organizations if they can find places to go that don't deal with providing information for people. So I think, obviously I'm speaking as a journalist, but I really do think that we have got to figure out how to better educate our people so that if the issue of reparations comes up or some of these other issues on how you deal with and conquer systemic racism, we've got to figure out how to communicate better with our people so that we can make these things that are necessary to have a more equitable society, a better society. And Albie, I just wanted to ask you one quick question, because I keep reading that while the South African, it has a Black majority, of course, the people in power are not them. That the power still lies in the hands of wealthy, predominantly white people. So how is that affecting things and change and people's attitudes and activism in South Africa?
The problem in South Africa is what do you mean by power? In terms of political power, the white industrialists, others, are very puny. In terms of control of state institutions, very puny. In terms of control of the economy, very strong. I had the rather extraordinary experience of seeing my son on TV. I was just watching last night. He's an economist and feeling very proud of them. And he was saying the problem in South Africa is the segregation of the economy coincides with the segregation of the lives the majority of people live. So it's not so much a question of power in the country, calling the shots. It's a question of controlling the economy, and we have two economies. And Mbeki raised that issue some time back. And until we deal with spatial apartheid, in which if you like, the races, the people are more integrated, we're still going to have the economy largely in the hands of whites and the majority being Black people. Right. But it's a funny country. Nobody's in power. Things function, things happen. And there's some advantages nobody being in power. It's not easy to have a dictator. We have a relatively weak army. I'm so pleased we have a weak army. I sometimes joke about, I'm so glad we've got a useless army. It's unfair to them. They do important peacekeeping matters. We bring about changes in South Africa, not with tanks going into the streets or 1 million people in the square, but a vote that's taken inside political parties, votes in parliament. So there's lots of very, very positive in this country. And people speak their minds. We've got great journalists, strong civil society. And in that sense, power is very dispersed in South Africa. And it's not as simple as people are representing it to you. Right. So it's lively, it's open, and we've got lots of young people who are so good. They're so bright, they're so sharp, they're so challenging. We must have done something right.
Well, we have that too. So let me just put an amen to that.
Teresa, what else should we be asking?
Okay, so we've got lots of questions, and they all seem to touch on very similar themes. So I'm going to read the question from Zubida Jafar, and I apologize if I've
Zubida Jafar.
Thank you.
Oh, wow, great. Okay. Nice to see you, Zubida.
Yeah. Okay, so Zubida says, greetings to Penny, Charlayne, and everyone. Albie and Charlayne, how would you describe the extent of racial equality in your respective countries today? Where do we stand in 2020?
Because I've just done it in advance of Subaida's question.
Right. I think that here in the United States, we do have tremendous imbalance. And I think that's what a lot of the discussion is about when it applies to COVID, or when it applies to every other economic situation. I mean, to be sure, and I don't want to take this away because I think Albie alluded to it, many people of color, and Black with a capital B, advanced as a result of the civil rights movement. We've got judges, we've got lawyers, we've got people in corporations, we've got bankers. There's a young banker I know in New York who is running for mayor. And I know a lot of successful capital B Black people. On the other hand, when you read the papers or when you go into these communities, you see a totally different picture. You see the result of inequality, the result of not having access to medicine, the result of not having access to all kinds of things that people with money have. So you have ongoing issues relating to systemic racism that people need to address. So whoever gets to be president of the United States and whoever brings in people to advise them, it would seem to me that would be one of the biggest challenges and one of the foremost things they need to get together, because that's affecting how people are looking at this race. That is absolutely affecting how people look at this race. And so if you want to have a more united country, and a country where you can bring people together, which they are not now in so many ways, you've got to address this systemic racism and these imbalances that exist in these communities.
So I wonder if I could just, I see that your friend Charlayne JD has asked a couple of questions. Teresa, do you want to read one of his questions? I think he posted 3.
That's Delhi.
Right. So
he probably knows the answers to them, but he's
yes, and there's some great questions. So the first one we have here is to Albie. What accounts for what we might call the smallness of the soul, the lack of generosity, now clearly in the air in South Africa? And to Charlayne, what parallels are visible in the US, a country that veered from Obama to Trump?
Go ahead, Albie.
Well, baby, I'm lucky. I'm meeting people whose souls are large and warm and spirited, and they're indignant about what's happening. And it's insupportable. And they're angry, and they're talking, and they're joking. One of the things I'm proud of in South Africa, I often say our biggest growth industry is stand-up comedians. We can love it ourselves. We can even export them to the US of A.
Yes, indeed.
But that's saying something about our country. And they come from all communities. We're a very alive society, very spirited society. And so there's disappointment. A lot of our political discourse is mean and shallow and spiteful and self-referential. That I would agree with. But in a way, you know, we fought with all our passion to create a more boring society where you don't put your life on the line, where you don't expand your soul at the risk of being tortured to death, just to achieve the different things. So I would rather put up with some of the meanness that we have now, if it means we're not subjected to the oppression that we have in the past.
Well, it's interesting here in the United States. I've been looking at the voting records, voting statistics, and they're all down. I mean, after 8 years of President Obama, the first Black president that I think I can't imagine a single Black person in this country who wasn't excited about his election. I flew from South Africa to report on the results that night, and everybody in that room was in tears, and there were Blacks and whites in the room, and educators and people of all different occupations. And it was a very exciting moment. But I think that when you listen to people who were in that administration, that administration was challenged by decades of inequality in this country. And so I'm not making any excuses, but the dreams that people had that a Black president could fulfill were dreams that were great to have, but they didn't always match reality, the reality of generations of inequality. And so this time around, while early results are showing, and I've got the television on silent up there because I keep looking at the blah, 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 blah about the election because that's all they're talking about. But the voting is down in every community. Anthony, am I right about that? Yes. And what that means is that with all the promise that people felt would be fulfilled by a Black president and people in progressive responsible positions in that administration, not everybody's dream was fulfilled, because we've had generations of systemic racism that it's going to, if you had an Obama for 16 years or maybe 20 years or longer, could possibly be fixed. But so many people did not have their dreams fulfilled under the Black president, even though he did a lot of good things, not least the Affordable Care Act and you know, giving people hope. But you've got these systemic issues. I keep using the same word, but that's the one I keep seeing in all of the analysis, that you've got to change. When you look at unemployment, for example, although the current administration is saying that, you know, they've improved the economy and created more jobs, Black unemployment is worse than it's ever been. So, you know, it's a challenging thing. And I think that people are tired of promises. They want to see results.
Yeah, I think that is probably, there was a question from Gay McDougall, Charlayne, about a book, but I think she can, it's just an inquiry about a book. I think we've got 5 or 4 minutes left.
Hi, Gay, call me.
Anthony, do we have time for more questions? So we've got 4 minutes left.
That means that Albie and I have to stop talking like we've talked the whole time.
Let's see where there is. This is a follow-up on a theme we started with earlier. The South African Constitutional Court seems to have survived the degeneration of politics in South Africa. The Supreme Court seems to be going in the opposite direction. Why is that?
Albie, Charlayne's going to tell you, so I may as well jump in with what Charlayne's going to say. Albie, you go first.
Okay, I'm not going to answer why in America. I'm going to say something about why in South Africa, and why, and from a very personal point of view, the sense of disillusionment was quite strong amongst the whole generation of people who fought very hard in the struggle. And they can't understand why I'm chipper and buoyant. One of the reasons is my years in Mozambique, where Mozambique got independence. We were very buoyant. It was wonderful being there with the revolution, as we called it afterwards. And then we couldn't sustain it, went down. It was calamity for the country. I lost an arm. There are thousands 100,000 people without legs from landmines. There were child soldiers. The economy was destroyed. And I felt, okay, we're not going to transform so quickly in South Africa. It's better that we don't. It meant the catastrophe of in that sense, from a human point of view, of Mozambique. But the other reason why I'm so chipper was going onto the court took me out of politics. I wasn't running for office. I didn't have to please anybody. I didn't have to get on with anybody, except my colleagues like Vikram Mosaneki. And it was a pleasure getting on with them. So we existed in a relatively pure realm, keeping alive the spirit of struggle. Anti-racism, non-sexism, social and economic rights, all of those things were our meat and drink. And we were able to do it. And what sustained us was the fact that the people supported it. Even though we gave decisions on same-sex marriage, on capital punishment, that might have been hugely popular in a popular sense, they supported the integrity of the court, the seriousness of the court, and the fact that we took the Constitution and human dignity very, very seriously. So for me, it was a very wonderful experience, extraordinary experience, 15 years on that court, but also for the court. It was in that sense protected from, by that very insularity that the court has to have, from the corrupting elements that many other areas of society would have. But also, we built in mechanisms for the choice of judges, the Judicial Service Commission, the kinds of inquiries, making it much more difficult for people to be appointed in ways that would be purely partisan and reduce the quality and integrity of the institution. Our elections also, very strong institutional protection, much less chance for voter suppression in South Africa than in another country I know, whose name I won't mention. So in that sense, the mechanisms of the Constitution have played a very important role in keeping constitutionalism alive. And that's giving hope to everybody in the country that if we have problems, they're serious problems, the country's not going down the drain because there is that institution, the press are playing a really important role, civil society is out there, people are outspoken, and ultimately our comedians are there to keep us on track.
Well, I'm a preacher's kid. I grew up here in Sarasota, in Florida. My mother used to send me down here to get some of that old time religion from my grandfather, who was a preacher, and my grandmother, who was the saint. And they used to teach me these songs. And one of them was, I don't believe you brought me this far to leave me. And then they taught me from Amazing Grace, which Obama sang at the Charleston funeral. And then I learned from Martin Luther King and that whole generation, we shall overcome someday. And I'm not giving up. As a journalist, I'm going to keep on keeping on and keep on being hopeful, because my faith is in the people who brought me thus far, and they're not going to leave me. All of you who participated, all of you who've been a part of this audience. Deli, hi there. I think you're somewhere here in Florida, and the Kong and all of my friends in South Africa, our second home. Ron sends love to all of you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for having me. I'm humbled by this experience.
Wonderful way to end this terrific program. We thank you, Charlayne, so much, and Albie. Penny, want to offer any closing remarks? Teresa?
I just want to say that I'm so grateful for your perspectives and your wonderful, rich insights. I wish this was not 90 minutes, but it was, 4 hours. There were so many things we could talk about, but thank you so much. And thank you, Teresa and Anthony, and of course, your team in the Dean's office, Anthony, for arranging all of this.
Thank you, Penny. You are extraordinary with this, as well as Teresa.
Yes, and I just want to echo the thanks to Charlayne and to Albie and to Penny and Anthony and the team at the Dean's office. It's been absolutely a wonderful privilege to work with all of you. I appreciate your time and commitment to this project to support this important conversation and also to support the legacy of Steve's work. So thank you all very much. And thank you to the audience, the great turnout to join us this afternoon. It's just wonderful to see.
Yes. Goodbye, audience. Thank you so much.
So much. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to vote.